Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my NACL week number 6 overview and analysis video in the spring split. We're really getting into the back half of things now. We've already started week number 7 as this video is coming out. For that, I do apologize. Of course, the NACL kind of being an extra day in the final week in week number 7, but we're going to be going over everything that happened in week 6 to kind of prepare you for what to expect at the end of the split. Still a lot to play for quite a few of these teams. Nothing is set in stone, and some of these teams are playing for their lives right now, so a lot on the line for them. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comment section below. Curious to know your thoughts and opinions on how things went for all 10 of the NACL teams this week, or at least the ones that did end up playing in our 6 best of 3s. But let's go ahead and get into the content itself, shall we? If you are new here, what we're going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series that we cover, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will, of course, also be updating my personal power rankings at the end of the video, going from number 1 to number 10, kind of talking about the direction that I think some teams are moving and whether or not I think you really are going to need to be scared about whether or not you're going to make the playoffs or whether or not you're going to be bottom 2 or anything like that, maybe not as good as you would want. We're going to be talking about where a lot of these teams are heading in terms of their direction, but for the most part today, we're going to talk about the 6 series we got in week number 6. So, without further ado, let's jump into day number 1, and we had a pretty good matchup to kick off day number 1 here. It was Luminosity Gaming taking on CCG Esports, and Luminosity is going to pick up the 2-0. It wasn't really that difficult of a series for them. They were definitely better in basically every aspect of this series, and this is where you really just have to start giving Luminosity a lot of credit. I'm not going to say that they were more questionable at the start of the split, because I think that that's completely disingenuous, quite frankly, to how they played. I think really the only series they struggled in was that DarkZero series, and obviously everybody's just kind of losing to DarkZero right now. I'm excited to talk about them later on in the week, but Luminosity has been easily the second best team in the NACL so far in 2025, and I don't think there's any reason to expect that to change. CCG is a good team. The top 5 in the NACL right now are all decently competitive, but numbers 4 and 5 of that list are definitely kind of on a tier below the top 3, and I think we continue to see that every single time we see them matched up against each other. It's just not necessarily as even at the top as maybe you would want. Luminosity is a bit ahead of those other teams, but let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series can go quite a few different directions for Luminosity. In my opinion, I'm giving it to Tomio in the jungle. It really did feel like he was the one that was creating the most for the team overall, but I think you can give it to almost anybody. Again, I really think there's a strong argument to be made that most of the players on this team deserve at least some level of a shout out. Tomio to me is getting it because I think he was the creator for the team. He was the one involved in the most amount of action and certainly the one setting the tempo. Dardoch was playing really aggressive, especially in game number 1 on the Lilia, and he just wasn't really able to stay consistent at all because Tomio was constantly in better positions, and that's to the credit of Tomio. I think he's playing a lot better over the second half of the split so far. Not that he was bad at all at the start of the split, just that I think he's been really good over the second half, like, best jungler in the league type of good over the second half, and that's what Luminosity needs if they're going to break through into being top 1. They need Tomio to be able to step up and be that facilitator that we know he can be. I like him on carries. I like him on things like, Rengar, as Deo shouted out in the post-game interview, but it's the Sejuani, it's the Maokai, it's things like that that he really broke through on, in my opinion, and that's what I'm going to need to continue to see in order for this team to feel as comfortable, because I think you have a lot of mouths to feed on this team, and even if other players are taking more of a back seat now than maybe they had in previous splits, it's still nice to know that Tomio can be that tempo player if you really need him to be. That facilitator is the term I like to use. I want to give a big shout out to the bot lane as well. They continue to be really good. Tactical got broadcast player of the series. I'm fine with that. Like, the Caitlyn was really nice in game number 1. He did a great job of, understanding that he didn't need to be the main character in that game, and then the Misfortune was a little bit more, primary carry option in game number 2, but I think Tactical is the player that I'm talking about when I say, like, this team has just adapted really well to understanding that not everybody can have resources all the time. I think Tactical's done a great job of playing more of a second fiddle type of role on this team, and even so, he's still standing out. I definitely do not regret putting him as my number 180 carry heading into the NACL year. I feel pretty justified in that at this point. Zeyzal was very sneakily amazing in this series, especially on the Braum in game number 1. Was super impressed with how he played that game. He was probably my player of the game in that first game. Breezy had no way to do anything on the other side of the map, and it's not like Zeyzal played worse on the Nautilus in game number 2. I've been decently critical of Zeyzal over the course of the last few years of his career. Just hasn't really felt like mechanically he's able to keep up with a lot of the top tier supports in North America. Not really a great sign there in my opinion, but this was one of the more more encouraging performances in quite a while. So excited to see that. Fake God ends up getting a quadra kill on Rumble in game number 2. Insanity mega gaps Aljun on the other side and plays off the pressure that Tomio generates really well. It's just all going right for Luminosity. This team is very, very good, and they're very consistent at this point. I really wouldn't put it past anybody right now, especially with some of the roster changes for DarkZero, to say that Luminosity is the team to beat in the NACL. I think that's totally fair at the moment. And then for CCG on the other side, there's some pluses and some minuses. I think the pluses are that this team is not just going to go quietly into the night. They're going to try and do some things, even if they don't always work out. Dardoch was very active in this series and was at least attempting to make some plays. The problem was it just wasn't enough. Dardoch ended up getting really out-tempoed on these champions that require it, like the Lilia, like the Xinjiao. Tomio was just better in this series, and that meant that a lot of the aggressive plays that he wanted to go for, they didn't really end up working out, and that really ended up taking itself out on the middle of the map here. Aljun is going to get dud of the series for me. The Corki, the Aurora, both of them were quite bad in this series, and, you know, we've seen this pretty regularly when CCG is losing to top-tier teams. It's often the mid lane that looks a little bit more suspect for them. I like Aljun as a prospect, as a player. I think he's really interesting moving forward, but it's definitely been much more of an adjustment period, and with this team's expectations kind of being set at top 4 at the current moment, you kind of need to see more out of the middle of the map here. I get that it's Luminosity, and you're not really expecting Aljun to be able to go up against Insanity and, like, you know, 1v1 him, but just surviving in the mid lane would be massive, and, you know, we've seen multiple series now where it feels like he has not even been able to do that against top-tier competition. We just need to see that progression happen, because he looks good against the bad teams. It just doesn't look quite as good against the good teams. I think there's also a lot of criticism to throw the bot lane's way. They've been incredibly consistent throughout this year. I would argue that Array and Breezy are maybe having both of the best years of their, you know, career right now, the best splits of their career. Breezy in particular I've been super impressed by, but he was very outplayed by Zazel in this series. Array could never really get going. Crimson was never able to do anything, especially on the rise in game number 2. CCG just didn't have the prio and the pressure to create, even if they were attempting to, and this really is just the difference between the best teams in the league and the teams that are good, but maybe not great right now. I like CCG. I think they're going to be fighting it out for number 4, but Luminosity is fighting it out for number 1, and that was definitely the kind of performance that they showed. This team gets better and better series over series, and I'm really excited to see where they go from here. Then moving on now to series number 2 of day number 1, and another pretty predictable outcome here as we saw DarkZero Dragonsteel taking on Apex Mission Impossible, and DarkZero is going to pick up the 2-0 win, but a lot to talk about in terms of how we ended up getting there. First off, DarkZero Storm was the roster that was fielded. That is the main roster that we've gotten accustomed to over the course of this split. Of course, DarkZero Light was playing last week, and so we kind of saw that version, the former Polestar team that ended up being teamless with all of the crazy shenanigans going on there. DarkZero putting in their, you know, main starting 5, but now their new main starting 5 because they've got a new jungler. Yuji is out. He has officially been signed by Team Liquid in the LTA North. That's obviously a fantastic get for them, and we'll talk about that a bit more in the LTA North video later on in the week, but DarkZero has to replace him, and so that's why they brought Shimmer in this offseason. They definitely had it, you know, kind of in their wavelength that, oh, this guy's probably going to go at some point this year. It's very unlikely that he lasts the entire year in Tier 2. We need to make sure that we have a jungler that can step in, and Shimmer has been the player that they've chosen to do that, at least in terms of early results, early returns on that investment. It's definitely paying off because he was excellent in this series, but AMI isn't exactly the most unbelievable competition in the world. That being said, they put up a good fight. Once again, I know it was a 0-2. I know they didn't take a game, but they looked pretty good, all things considered, in this series. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. Shimmer is going to get my player of the series. I really just didn't want to give it to anybody else. Not only was this like the coming out party for Shimmer, this is a player who's not only never played in Tier 2, but has never really even been at the top of Tier 3. He's a pretty unknown player to be thrust into such a big position already, but he was the main character. Like, they drafted around him, they played around him in terms of where the resources went across this series, and so he definitely deserved player of the series here. Low Jazz was not really able to keep up in terms of a lot of the aggressive plays. Not that I think he played bad, just that I think, you know, DZ did a great job of playing around Shimmer and getting him comfortable specifically on that Nefiri in game number 2, but he was still very good on the Xinjiao in game number 1. You know, I have a decent amount of knowledge on Shimmer, you know, especially in this offseason. He was announced pretty early for Maryville alongside Toasty, alongside Sajed, and so, you know, we kind of went along and, you know, watched a lot of tape from him, but there is still a lot of unknowns when it comes to whether or not he's going to be able to perform. This team wants to win the entire league, and he's never played in Tier 2 before. That's a really big ask from a player like Shimmer, but at least in terms of the first series, he is paying it back out. I want to continue to give a lot of credit to the solo laner. Spyrax continues to be unreal in the mid lane. I would argue that individually, from a carry perspective, this might be his best split ever. It's certainly up there, in my opinion. I've always kind of talked about Spyrex as if he's this player that's, the shove and roam, play for jungle type of mid laner, and he is that, I think, at his core, but he can still be somebody that takes a lot of resources, plays something like Sylas or Aurora, and is a bit more of a main character in terms of the damage that's being output in the back half of these games. He was way better than Fimini on the other side, which was pretty big. Sajed and Zyko continue to be really nice as a bot lane. I've been very impressed with their 2v2 ability. Not that it should be surprising, but I think Sajed is also playing better right now than he did on FlyQuest last year. He was already pretty good on Fly, but his role on that team was a lot more simplified. All he really had to do was step up in team fights because the rest of the team was doing most of everything else. On this team, I think he's being given more responsibility in the early game, and he's living up to it. Zamudo's the best top laner in the league. Like, it's all just clicking for DarkZero. Now, are they guaranteed the best team in the league without Yuji? It's definitely more so up for debate, and I think we're really going to get a chance to see that as we go into playoffs, because the rest of the regular season is honestly pretty simple for them, but at the very least for now, like, Shimmer in his first series looks pretty solid, and if he can just be 80, 70% of what Yuji was for this team, they absolutely can still win the NACL. That's how dominant they were before. And then for AMI on the other side, they put up a good fight. Like, you can't even really be all that mad about the performance that AMI ended up giving here. I think that they were major underdogs going into this series for very obvious reasons, and you know what? Like, they tried their best. They didn't have the talent to be able to come out on top. DarkZero was definitely the better of these two teams, but it's not like they stopped trying to make plays. They were aggressive on the map. They actually won a couple of skirmishes and fights over the course of this series, and, it's just a positive look overall for them. Fimini, unfortunately, is going to get that dud of the series for me, mostly for that Tristana game in game number 2 that really did not end up going his way. We kind of saw them, I wouldn't say gigantic, but the pretty large difference between the solo laners in this series. Decoy and Fimini just weren't really able to survive against players like Zamudo and Spyrex, who were incredibly good. Mid lane especially felt like a pretty big gap in favor of DarkZero. That's okay. Fimini, we talked about it with Aljun, a very similar player in my opinion, in the previous series, where it just takes a little bit of time to get used to playing at this level, especially playing against such experienced mid laners in, Insanity and now Spyrex. I think it's definitely going to be a bit more up in the air, but Fimini, unfortunately, is going to get that. Low Jazz was out jungled by Shimmer, but Shimmer also got a ton more resources from his own individual team, where I think Low Jazz had to create more himself. Baz and Pocus, I think, were fine on the bot side, but overall, this is one of those series that you go, AMI did interesting things. They stayed active and aggressive on the map, playing around things like the Vi in game number 1. They just actually weren't able to win the fights that really matter because they're not as mechanically talented as DarkZero. That's okay. They're not supposed to be. I think this is still an okay showing, and it's a good showing for DarkZero. Once again, I hate to keep reiterating my point, but, it's all nice and well and good to get integrated by playing AMI, by playing one of these bottom tier teams, but it's really going to be the upper table clashes that show us where DarkZero was at. Maybe they're still number 1. Maybe they've fallen in the power rankings with Yuji leaving and Shimmer coming in, but at least for now, it looks pretty good. Then moving on now to day number 2, our middle day here in week number 6, and we kicked off day 2 with the matchup between Conviction and Polestar, and again, pretty predictable. Conviction's going to be able to take the 2-0 series win, and unlike the first ones that we saw, not quite as much of a fight being put up by Pulse. I will give a lot of credit where credit is due. A couple of players on the side of Pulse played really well in this series. Hub was excellent for Polestar. Dr. Calculus, I think, was also pretty relevant. Shen has received buff after buff after buff over the past few patches, and is finally gotten into a spot where he can be pretty competitive, but at the end of the day, Conviction is a very good team. I've kept them at number 4 in my power rankings. Obviously, them and CCG are kind of fighting it out for that number 4 spot. They're going to get a chance to play for it in week number 7, but Conviction really kind of stepping up and moving themselves to 5-2 here with this series. We'll go ahead and talk about it. Darkwings is going to get yet another player of the series for me. He was player of the week, I think, for the entirety of the NACL last week in week number 5. It's good to see a lot of that momentum carry itself over. This is mostly for the Syndra game in game number 2 that I really thought was, where things ended up going very right for Conviction. He played that game so well in terms of his positioning and just being able to take over the game. I think things have gotten better for Darkwings in particular as a player when he started playing a lot more of these long-range, burst mages. Hui, Syndra, we saw him play Orianna. Like, these champions, I get that things like, Sylas or Talia or Aurora or Ryze can be very tempting right now in the current meta because a lot of other people around the world are finding a ton of success on it. But I think if you are better at this style of champion, especially at a level like this here in the NACL where things are so chaotic, quick, and you can kind of just get away with being good at the things you're good at, go ahead and pick those things. You don't have to worry too much about like being a bit of a meta slave, especially in the mid lane right now where I think you can play around a lot of different things. Darkwings has shown that as he has gone further back into his own kind of champion pool, he has gotten a lot better in terms of the production. Now, part of that lines up with them playing weaker teams in terms of the power rankings, in terms of the standings, and Pulse is obviously not like the hardest competition in the world. They're still winless in terms of series score, but Darkwing's doing a much better job, I would say, over the past couple of weeks of really being able to dominate games, and he's been awesome as a mid laner, especially over the past 2 to 3 weeks, so I'm just hopeful he's going to be able to keep that up. But the rest of this team still also performing. Chrome and Manui continue to be very strong as a bot lane duo. Chrome is really kind of settling into his spot here as being a bit more of a late game carry. I think he does get some shine in the early game, but things like the Sivir definitely stand out in terms of how Conviction want to play. Manui is not getting nearly enough credit for how good his engages are and how good his mid games are in particular. I'm really excited to see that growth continue to happen. He's getting better every game in the support position, you know, being somebody who role swapped there this split. Kisno was really, really solid here. Bio, in my opinion, has been clearly the best player on Polestar across 2025. It's nice to see that, you know, Kisno can just kind of dominate that matchup. Kisno, for as much as we talk him up as a player who's, you know, been at the tier 2 level before and has a lot of success playing in tier 3, he's never really found success in tier 2. This is the best and most successful team he's ever played for at the tier 2 level, and so that's really nice to see. I'm a big fan of Hoarder. I've talked about that a lot on the channel. I think that he is a very fun top laner to talk about, you know, as one of the more interesting ones in North America moving forward, but Conviction just picking up the win that they expected to pick up. No real surprises here. And then for Pulse on the other side, they're just not a team that's going to be able to compete with actual good rosters, and there's just not much else to say about Polestar at this point in the split. They moved to 0-7. They're not technically eliminated just yet. They have 2 more series to play. Of course, it's single round robin here in the NACL, so each team ends up playing 9 series. Pulse still have 2 more opportunities, but one of those, I believe, is against Near Airport. That doesn't look particularly winnable for Polestar, and if they drop another series and they are officially going to be bottom 2, they're going to have to go into the promotion relegation tournament to make sure that they can survive, and, you know, I don't think a lot of people have a lot of confidence for them going into that tournament. And unfortunately for them, this is just what we all expected. You know, this was a disastrous offseason for Pulse, and I think, unfortunately, in terms of the results, that's kind of what we're seeing on the Rift. Adam is going to get yet another dud of the series for me. I feel really bad giving him this over and over again because I think that his mentality makes a lot of sense towards adding value to Polestar. The problem is I just don't think the mechanics are there right now. He's not good enough to go up against players like Darkwings and a lot of these more experienced tier 2 mid laners. Even if he is super aggressive and constantly looking for plays, it's often at the detriment of his own team, and it's just, you know, it's frustrating in that regard. I think that there is a player in here that you can, you know, grow and develop, but he is clearly thrust into a situation that it's too soon for him to be playing at the tier 2 level. That has become very clear, and that's kind of the case for everybody here. I'm glad to see that Hub and Tubbs have continued to be fine. Hub in particular was really nice on the Xayah in game number 2. Tubbs kind of ran it at times on both the Alistar and the Rakan, but, you know, at least there's some sort of positivity. Dr. Calculus had a couple of moments on the Shen. He's been mostly bad, I would say, so far in tier 2. Like I said, Bio's probably been the best player on Polestar, but he got mega out-jungled in this series by Kisno. It's not a great look overall. Like, you're not sitting here going, oh, Pulse might actually be better than expected. They pulled off some games every once in a while, which I think is better than maybe what my expectation was for them coming into this split, but this is not a competitive team. They are almost certainly going to be bottom 2, and they might even go winless. I think it's actually projected for them to go winless, depending on what happens in that matchup against Supernova next week, but Pulse is exactly who we thought they would be, a team that's really struggling at the tier 2 level, and, you know, we'll see if we see this org again in summer. But for Conviction on the other side, they're fighting it out for top 4 right now. They have a pretty good inside track to be given that, you know, standing, to be given that accolade of top 4. They're going to have to earn it next week, though. They go up against CCG. That's the big matchup that I think I and a lot of other people have been waiting for. They're the 2 teams that are kind of right on the cusp of being near the top 3. Whoever wins that's going to be the best of the rest right now in the NACL, and Conviction, I think, has really shown over the past couple of weeks, especially once they started getting back on track, that there's really no reason it can't be them. But then moving on to our second series of day number 2 here, and we finally don't get a clean 2-0 sweep as we saw Blue Otter taking on Near Airport, but it's not the Near Airport you remember. More substitutions coming in at the very least for this week, but despite the substitutions, Near Airport is going to take this series 2-1. Blue Otter put up a really great fight in this one. This is the best they've looked in quite a long time. I actually am going to give them a ton of praise throughout this segment because I really think they looked excellent, and it's clear that they are getting better. The problem is Near Airport is a very good team, and the player that ended up subbing in for Near Airport, or one of the two players that ended up subbing in for Near Airport, is ridiculously talented, and if you can just kind of point him in a direction, all of a sudden things get a lot easier, and that's what we saw. Obviously, first and foremost, you got to talk about it. Double Lift and Biofrost, unavailable for week number 6. They announced that on social media a couple of days before the games ended up starting. We knew that was going to be the case. It's Sushi and Kelpo that end up coming in to replace them respectively in their roles, and man, do they not just replace them, but they live up to the standard that Near Airport had for this series by popping off. Sushi is going to get my player of the series, and this isn't just, oh, he got integrated as a new player and we want to give him some props for being able to come in and stabilize the team. No, they actively played around him in game number 3. He was the focal point of that game, and he ended up winning it for the team. We know Sushi is a very, very good prospect at the tier 3 level. My scouting report has always been kind of similar on Sushi, where he's got incredible mechanics. If you can just point him in a direction, he's going to be able to figure it out. He doesn't have a full, complete package in terms of his game just yet, at least from my perspective. I think there's a lot of things he needs to work on in terms of lane timing and then, playing around certain different, losing matchups down in the 2v2 to make sure he doesn't get run over early. But when you can get him pressure, again, he is unbelievable hands-wise. He is one of the most talented players in tier 3 when you're just looking at the raw mechanical skill that he offers. And so to see him get a chance to play with players like Spica and Pobelter that are very smart at the game, have a really good idea and understanding of where exactly they want to put a lot of those resources, all of a sudden it makes things pretty easy for Sushi to be able to pop off, and that's exactly what he was able to do. Again, this is not a pity player of the series or one where it's like, oh, he stepped in and so he should probably get it. No, he was the best player on the Rift in this series and he deserved to get shout out. There were some other good performances. I think Spica played really well. Kelpo did a great job of setting things up, I would say, all things considered, for Sushi, but things weren't all perfect for Near Airport. Blue Otter put up a very strong fight in this series. They certainly came to play here today, especially in game 2, but even throughout the beginning of game number 3, it really required a Tristana comeback in order for NA to be able to take it. Now, part of that was top lane losing a bit of pressure. When you look at the first 2 games, TF played really not all that clean, especially in that second game on the Scion. We've been more encouraged by TF play because he's looked a lot better on weak side tanks than maybe we expected, but that was not the case when Quacker was really fed on the Olaf in that second game. But it's not like Quacker didn't play great in game 1 on the Mbessa as well. And then Pobelter, while I think generally he was fine, I think Samikin was better on the other side of this matchup, and we'll talk about it. Samikin had a really great series, but it didn't matter. In the end, Near Airport had the best player on the Rift, and somehow, some way, it's their substitute AD carry here, and that's massive overall for them. And, I just hope to see Sushi more. It doesn't seem like he's going to be continuing here for Near Airport, obviously with Double Lift and Biofrost coming back, but if this was his audition to get a spot in tier 2, he passed with flying colors. And then for Blue Water on the other side, a lot to like. Honestly, way more to like than to dislike in terms of how they played this. They were underdogs coming into this series, regardless of the fact that the Near Airport bot lane was subbing out for this one. They still were, definitely not favorites coming in, and they put up a really, really great showing, and they took Near Airport to the brink. And honestly, there was a big part of that game 3 early game where I was like, oh, Blue Otter's gonna win this series. They're the better team. Unfortunately, it just didn't end up, working out that way. I think the solo laners are the first 2 that I really want to point out. Quacker was exceptionally good in this series. That Olaf absolutely decimated game number 2, but he was awesome on the Mbessa in game number 1 as well. Samikin was really great in this series on the Talia in game 2, on the Hui in game number 3. He's really starting to get into form, and Blue Otter, as they did last year, is starting to ramp up the more games that they play. Unfortunately for them, they just didn't have the firepower to be able to overcome the 5v5 team fighting gaps at the end, and that's kind of the underlying problem for Blue Otter. And I do have to give dud of the series to somebody, so unfortunately it's going to go to Rovex. I do like how Rovex ended up playing a lot of this series, but I think when you look at everybody on the team, he was the player that I think was the most exploitative, if you will, the most exploited throughout the series in terms of his positioning, specifically on that Alistair at the end of game number 3 where he was dying really early on into the fights. Kelpo was really solid on the other side, and I think this was the matchup that Blue Otter really needed to win. When you're looking at, how these two teams break down, top lane obviously was pretty solid, and you can argue that was in favor of Blue Otter, especially at the beginning of the series, but if bot lane was going to lose here, and if Rovex in particular was not going to be as good as Kelpo on the other side, that was going to be a pretty big problem for Blue Otter, and I've just been a little bit disappointed with where Rovex has been at so far in 2025 because he was so good last year. Same thing for Levitate. It hasn't felt like this bot lane has clicked even remotely in a similar way to what happened in 2024. So hopefully they can get back on track, but still, it's a good performance from Blue Otter. I know they're sitting at 2-5, but with the way that things break down, if they can go out there next week and pick up a win against AMI, that's who they're playing next week. If they can go out there and pick up that win, get to 3 wins and kind of sit there and, everything kind of goes wrong for Winthrop as is expected with their very difficult week next week, or depending on how things go at the end of this week, we're really looking at Blue Water still being favored to take that number 6 spot, but it's a lot more open than maybe we were expecting. And near Airport, to their credit, they have kept a lot of that momentum going. This is a top 3 team very clearly, and they've shown that they are there with or without their very strong bot lane. That's just how good the rest of this team is, but Sushi is a genuine star in the making in Tier 3, and I'm really excited to see if his trajectory and his showing here ends up getting him more play at the Tier 2 level somewhere. But then moving on now to our third and final day of week number 6 here in the NACL, and we kicked off day 3 with a matchup between Apex Mission Impossible and CCG Esports, where CCG is going to pick up a very dominant 2-0. Game 1 looked a little bit more back and forth, but CCG really came to play here today, kind of reasserting themselves near the top of the standings. I think some people were getting a bit concerned with how they had played against some of the top tier teams, me included, where it's like, they look pretty good against the bad teams. They look like a team that's going to be very consistent, but do they have enough firepower to consistently be able to dominate teams? Well, they came out here and dominated. They looked awesome in this series across the board, really everything kind of going right for them. And then for AMI on the other side, I think they're just crashing back down to earth. I think for me, that's the best way I can possibly say it. We predicted that they were going to be closer to what Polestar is than what 7th or 8th place was. They have been way better than that, but I've kept them at number 9 in my power rankings, despite the fact that they have overperformed that in terms of their actual production, because I just don't know if that projects to be the case moving forward. I think we are seeing some natural regression come in from AMI, and they are still a team that's very much in danger of getting bottom 2, depending on what the result at the end of day 3 here is and what happens in week number 7. And so you don't want to be losing this series 0-2 in particular, but for CCG, in terms of their win, I think that there are a lot of things to point out in a positive light. Pretty much everything on the team ended up going right for them in this series, but player of the series for me is going to go to Crimson on the top side for Sion and for Ambessa, specifically for this Ambessa in game number 2. It's nice to see that Crimson starting to get some confidence under his belt. I think this happened last year where he started to level up as the split went along. He certainly wasn't perfect at the start of summer last year, but I think things definitely felt a bit more, comfortable and just overall, good for him down the stretch in the summer split. It's nice to see that that trajectory has kind of carried over a bit into 2025. We maybe wanted to see it a bit earlier in the 2025 split, but Decoy did not put up even a fight at all in terms of how this laning phase ended up going. He got some gigantic leads on the top side and was able to translate them relatively efficiently. A lot of the conversation around Crimson has been his last name and his family. I think there is a lot to talk about for him as a player as well. I don't think that he's just another, player in a long line of, top lane mains in the family, but I think that there is a lot to talk about for him individually, and I'm glad to see that he's starting to express that on his own right. I think it's really nice to see that Aljun could really turn around some of that form. It doesn't change my opinion on Aljun in terms of who he is as a player. I'm still very concerned about what happens when he goes up against the best mid laners in the league, when he's playing Spyrax, when he's playing Insanity, these more, proven, consistent mid laners, Pobelter, obviously. Those are the matchups that I think Aljun is really going to struggle in. But at the very least, if you're going to have trouble against the top tier players, if you want to be a middle tier, mid laner, you got to be able to beat up on the bottom tier mid laners, and that's what he did here going into Fimini, who had a pretty bad week, all things considered. It's nice to see Aljun getting a little bit more comfortable here. Dardoch continues to be very aggressive. I love how he's playing right now. I think he's been one of the most fun junglers to watch in the league, full stop, regardless of, where they're at in the standings. Dardoch has been really, really enjoyable. It's clear the macro influence that he has on this team as a whole, and just generally, the tempo setting that he does. He is the veteran on this team, and it shows in terms of the in-game decision making, and I'm happy to see that. Array and Breezy were a bit more back on track in this one. Breezy especially I thought was really good. Not that Array was bad, just everybody on the team clicking for CCG. This is more of what we wanted to see against AMI. This is kind of the version of CCG that needed to show up earlier this week and just wasn't able to do it. It's better late than never, but at some point you're going to have to start competing against those upper tier teams. And then for AMI on the other side, it's just unfortunate that this team is kind of losing steam in the way that they are. They had such a promising start to the split. It felt like they were going to overperform expectations. It felt like they were following up on their open qualifiers run in a really nice way. But again, I hate to use the term crashing back down to earth, but I think this is more realistic towards what the expectations for this roster actually were, where they're just kind of getting outplayed in most areas. Decoy's going to get my dud of the series here. I've been pretty underwhelmed by Decoy in the top lane. There was a real opportunity for him to be a top 5 or a top 6 top laner this split because it was so wide open. There's basically no players who have consistent experience at the tier 2 level here outside of Zamudo and, of course, Fake God. Really, outside of those two, it's pretty open. TF Blade was kind of up there. Quacker's a player who's had a lot of experience. Crimson played last split, but those are the players you have to be better than in order to be like top half, and I thought Decoy could be in that conversation. He's really not been. He's been one of the weaker top laners in the league, and I think that is obviously not ideal. AMI itself have their own struggles, and that, sometimes takes itself out on top lane in terms of the production, but I just have not been impressed individually by his laning stats. Fimony had a really bad week overall. I'm not going to try and spoil Dead of the Week or anything like that, but certainly keep an eye on Fimony, who I think just wasn't particularly productive, especially going into a player like Aljum, where you need to be able to start getting those leads there. Lojaz certainly got out jungled by Dardoch. I don't think Lojaz had a particularly eventful week. Baz and Pocus I don't think were the problem. They were definitely, the more consistent part of the team overall, but AMI just kind of playing like we expected AMI to play. They don't have the firepower to compete against a team like CCG, who is top 5. Again, top 5 in the NACL feel very clear at the current moment, and AMI just don't have the strength to be able to push into that, and CCG, to their credit, have kept that up for the entire split. They're sitting at 5-3. Maybe you want to see them be a bit more consistent, but those 3 losses are to the 3 best teams in the NACL, and they have that matchup with Conviction next week. That's really going to determine a lot for where this team ends up landing. They're easily top 4 if they're able to take down Conviction. It's really just about whether or not they're able to do it. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here in week number 6. And man, this is a big one in terms of how the standings are going, and because this is a gigantic rivalry here in the NACL. It was Supernova taking on Winthrop University, and Winthrop is going to pick up the 2-1 series win in the collegiate brawl between Ole Miss and Winthrop. Winthrop is going to come out on top here in tier 2, and that's kind of been the case for how things have gone for them throughout the entire split. They move themselves to 3-4. This guarantees that they will not have to worry about getting into the bottom 2. They are safe. At the worst, they're getting top 8. In terms of how things are going, playoffs might not be locked in or anything like that for Winthrop, but, they are really on a good path. They're sitting at 8-9 in terms of game score, and on the other side of this, Supernova is in full panic mode at this point. They have done everything wrong up until here. Like, everything that could have gone wrong has gone wrong for Supernova. This team has not looked even remotely comfortable at all at the tier 2 level. It's funny because things are going well for them in CLOL. It's just crazy to see how it's not working out in tier 2 for this team going up against similar competition, but, Supernova has really not been able to make the most of their opportunities, and I think there's some really obvious places to start pointing in terms of where the problems are. We're going to start with Winthrop, as we always do in terms of the winning side. Player of the series should go to one of the 2 carry duo players here, either Sword or Mobility. I'm giving it to Sword in the mid lane because I think the mid lane gap in this series was absolutely ginormous between these 2 teams. Sword completely gapped Asila on the other side of this. I like Asila as an interesting prospect, and I think he's been very good in tier 3, but Sword has been way better here in tier 2, and even way better than I expected. He was awesome at the beginning of the split when Winthrop was picking up a lot of wins that people weren't anticipating. I think back to that Blue Otter series and, generally the series against teams like Pulse and AMI, where Winthrop honestly looked pretty good. And I think it would be fair to generally say that Sword has been a gigantic part of why that has been the case and why the form has looked so solid for Winthrop. Now, Mobility is a big part of that. Only 35, I think, is a big part of that in terms of the consistency of this team, and especially where a lot of the resources go. But let's not pretend like Sword hasn't arguably been the most valuable player on Winthrop across this split. It's just been really fun to watch, and I think he stepped up once again. Again, seeing such a gigantic mid-gap in this series, seeing Sword completely outplay Asila on the other side of this is massive, especially because he's one of the only players on the team with actual, tier 2 or above experience. It's him, and it's only 35. Denethor obviously played last year for this team as well, but that's, the same thing as saying, Crimson has a ton of experience. Denethor has a little bit of experience at this level, but Sword is one of the veterans for this Winthrop team that needs to be able to step up, and he has so far. When you're talking about a reason this team is sitting at 3-4, I think Sword should be the first player you're talking about when it comes to Winthrop, especially in a mid lane pool right now in the NACL that's honestly not nearly as deep as maybe you would want it to be. I think it's, very open in the middle of the pack, and Sword is kind of near the top of that list for me right now. But you do still have to give a lot of credit to the bot lane. I've said pretty much over and over again on this channel every single time this team plays a series that Mobility and Only 35 kind of dictate whether or not this team is allowed to win games, and we saw it here on the Jhin and the Nautilus in game number 3, where Mobility and Only 35 kind of run that 2v2 in the laning phase, completely shut down Shogo and Rhino, and are able to kind of take that pressure and transition it into the mid game alongside the Vi and the Talia to really create this big macro advantage that they can then use to just win the game outright. That's what you need to see from Mobility and from Only 35. That's not what they've been been giving over the past couple of weeks, and so it's nice to see them get back into form. Of course, you know, a lot of banter between Shogo and Mobility Shogo, saying that he's Mobility's father, not necessarily living up to that in this series, which we will talk about, but credit to the bot lane, credit to Sword, credit to the carry duo. I think they were the main ones here. I think Denethor also had a really nice series on the top side. He's fine as a player. Again, I don't think top lane is particularly good in the NACL right now from a depth perspective, but the Cassante was fine, generally speaking. That's the only game you're a little concerned about. Really like the Gwen in game 3, like the Camille in game number 1. I think overall Denethor looks a lot more comfortable when he gets to play these matchups where he can, you know, get counterpick early on in the game. So, you know, credit to Denethor. Wilson was also fine. I'm not trying to downplay what Wilson was able to do. I just don't think he was quite as relevant as the actual laners in this series. But it's a big win for Winthrop to keep their hopes alive, to guarantee them a spot in the NACL going into the summer split, and to, you know, keep their playoff hopes in a good spot. Because if they win at all next week, if they win a single series and pull off that upset against either, I believe, DarkZero or near Airport, if they're able to pull off the upset against either of those two teams, then they're in top 6 and they're going to be in playoffs, which would be a pretty massive success for them. And then for Supernova on the other side, this team is just bad. Like, they're bad in a lot of different areas, which I think is the most frustrating part for me, is that it's not just one or two players that are really letting the team down. They do have a lot of players who are underperforming in terms of what the expectations are, but this team is like broken at a macro level, and it doesn't really feel like they know how to play out a lot of the mid games that they end up getting themselves into. Shogo had gold in this series, and Rhino really wasn't all that bad in terms of engaging, but their 2v2 wasn't very good, even if they were better in the team fight stage. And then you look at the rest of the map, everybody else was losing. Asile is the easy choice for dead of the series. He was the only player who was bad in all 3 games, including in Supernova's win in game 2, where he got blasted on Syndra in lane, and it just did not matter. I've really not been impressed at all with Asile so far this year. I think that there is a lot of growth that needs to happen out of the mid lane here, but that's kind of the case for a lot of teams near the bottom of the standings. We already talked about it a bit with Mini. We've seen Adam really struggle as like an aggressive player for Pulse. Even someone like Aljun has had some up and down moments for CCG. Like, it's just not a super strong mid lane class in terms of the NACL this split, and even then, like, you know, Asila's not really been able to capitalize. This was a very disappointing series for me, but I think when you're talking about a player who, and I hate to use this term, but has disappointed me the most across this entire split, it's Keel in the jungle. What happened to Keel, man? This guy was an MVP finalist just a couple of years ago on Wildcard. He was a very interesting player. He was playing for Team Liquid Challengers for last year. Like, it really felt like this guy was on the climb to be one of the more consistent junglers at this level. It's fallen off the rails in 2025. It's not going well. He's been outplayed in almost every single series that they have played. This is a guy who has really been known for his macro and his creative, you know, champion pool, things like Karthus and Nunu, and that's all gone. It's out the window. It's by the wayside at this point. He's just not been, not only he's not been useful, he's not even been average. He's been like a significantly below average player. He's been one of the worst junglers in the NACL in a league where I think a lot of people expected him to be one of the shining spots for Supernova. I get it. He's a more aggressive player, and inherently, if your lanes are going to be losing, that style is going to get punished more, but he has been bad, straight up bad. He has to be better than this. Stray is not good enough on the top side. Shogo and Rhino, again, weren't even as good as their KDA would suggest, in my opinion, in this series, because they were losing 2v2 in the bot lane. It's just not a great look for Supernova, and they're 1-6. If they drop their series next week to Pulse, it's over. Like, they're done, and I'm not saying that that's likely to happen. They absolutely should be able to beat up on Pulse, but this is the kind of loss that cannot happen for a team like Supernova. The fact that this is left up to chance in the first place is super, super unideal for them, and if they're able to survive and not get to that relegation tournament, it's going to be off of luck and not necessarily off of their gameplay. And then for Winthrop, it's obviously a great win. If they can somehow pull off an upset next week, they're going to be in playoffs, which is a massive, massive plus. Winthrop was kind of looked at as the weakest of the collegiate teams heading into this split. They have proven to be much, much more than that, and they really proved that here today. All right, but that is going to do it for my Week 6 NACL overview and analysis video. Up on the screen, the updated standings after 6 weeks of action here in the NACL. We can go over risers and fallers, but nothing really changing here. Everything kind of going as anticipated this week. Winthrop really kind of, you know, confirming their spot, we'll just say, in the upper echelon. We do know, at the very least, that the top 5 teams have qualified for the playoffs. They are guaranteed top 6. It is just a fight between Winthrop, Blue Otter, and AMI to get that spot. I believe Supernova and Pulse can no longer make playoffs. They can technically survive if everything were to go right for them, but definitely not on the cards for them, at least in terms of likeliness. But overall, we kind of know where these teams stand at this point. It's really going to be about week number 7 and who ends up stepping up and who ends up stepping aside to see who gets that final spot at number 6, mostly between Winthrop and Blue Otter, and who's going to be able to survive. Is Supernova going to be able to get above Apex Mission Impossible? You know, they're going to have to beat Pulse, and they're going to have to hope for an AMI loss. Both of those things are very much possible, almost expected from both of those orgs, but we're going to have to see how it ends up going, so I'm excited. Hope you guys are as well. Let me know if you agree or disagree with me not making any changes. Again, no surprises this week, so no real reason to feel like we need to make them, but let's go ahead and move on to my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 6. Player of the week, it's going to go to Sushi, the AD carry, substitute here for Near Airport, the player coming in and playing for Doublelift. I truly do believe that he was the best player across this week, and I'm serious, man. This guy's got to get an opportunity at the tier 2 level because of this performance. This was absolutely massive from him. Blue Otter showed up to play in that series, and Sushi still was the best player on the Rift. I was crazy impressed with what he was able to do, and I'm certainly not saying like, oh, keep Sushi, get rid of Doublelift, but there's a reason we've been hyping this guy up at the tier 3 level. I'm glad to see that he was given an opportunity and he knocked it out of the park. And then my honorable mentions, my runner-ups, if you will, Darkwings, the mid laner for Conviction. He was player of the week last week. He's going to get an honorable mention this week. He played really well in their series win. And then Shimmer, the new jungler for DarkZero. A lot of new subbed in players getting a lot of player of the week honorable mentions. That goes to show just how well a lot of these guys did coming in and, having their first opportunities coming up from tier 3. So nice on Shimmer, nice on Darkwings, but Sushi is going to get my player of the week. And then my dud of the week is going to go to Mini, the mid laner for Apex Mission Impossible. It just wasn't a particularly great week for Mini in general. AMI really struggled in both of their series. I think especially in that second one, they just didn't really have any pressure and they were looking for a lot more against CCG. They're going to need to pick up the pace. They technically still can get top 8 and survive that relegation, requalification that they need to go through, but they're going to have to do it now. It's do or die for AMI, and the middle of the map's going to have to be better. Mini definitely still learning and growing, but unfortunately for him, he's going to get my dud of the week, and Sushi will be getting my player of the week. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the NACL, although we will post about the rest of the year. That includes next week, week 7, the final week of the regular season, as well as the playoffs, which are right around the corner. But we also cover all 4 of the major regions as well here: LTA North, LEC, LCK, and LPL every single week on this channel. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all